This morning on For the Record, a Madison writer talks about his fascinating new book on his experiences in Vietnam some 43 years ago. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. I find it remarkable how much power the war in Vietnam has to this day. It not only influenced many of us profoundly, it's influenced more of us in more ways than many of us recognize. I hope to be able to explain that as I welcome to For the Record this morning the author of an amazing new book, Daros Vietnam, Dispatches from the Air-Conditioned Jungle, Doug Bradley. Doug, welcome.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me.
It's going to be hard to mask the fact that we are old friends.
That's right.
And have been friends for many years. You have worked in communications at the UW, I think, for
forever.
Most of the time that I've known you.
We first met at Vet's house. If
Yeah.
you remember,
Yeah.
you interviewed me way back when you were in radio,
Yep.
getting your chops as a journalist,
Yeah.
and you did some great interviews with us at Vet's house, which we had set up in the early '70s to help. Is Vietnam era vets helping themselves, because we weren't getting a lot of help, as you know, from not just the book, from having lived through that.
Yep.
And so I've always had fond memories of you knowing a good story and also knowing what was important for the community to be focused on and attentive to. So thank you for that.
You know, even though from that beginning and just knowing that you were a vet, well, I've known a lot of vets, and I think it says something that we don't really appreciate what that means for people, how big an influence it is in their life. It's something that, you know, was a public part of your life, but you didn't necessarily wear it on your sleeve. It's not something that came up in every conversation.
Absolutely.
And yet now reading this book, Doug, realizing that for some 40 years, you've been thinking about that experience and what it meant for you in these stories.
Yeah, and it still does. You know, as I said in the book, and I every day Vietnam is still a part of who I am and what I do. And I was just fortunate that the situation for me there, that we always talk among Vietnam vets about the 3 W's: when you were there, what you did, and where you were. And boy, did that have a difference on every. You're just changing one of those, but if you change all 3, you know, if I'm there in '68 around Tet, I'm probably, because I'm drafted, a grunt, an infantryman, and I am. It doesn't matter where I am in country. When that came, it came with a fury. I mean, if you were a clerk in Saigon, you had to pick up a gun and defend yourself. So, you know, that's this quirk about Vietnam, and I was lucky. 70 and 71 in the rear as an Army journalist. But it still doesn't mean it totally changed my life. I know I'm a different person, and my life is very different as a result of that year in Vietnam.
Well, and I think people who read this book, first of all, will likely come at it with the idea that this is going to be a book about combat, and that most people's impressions of Vietnam are about combat.
You said it.
This is not only about how someone who is not in combat was, again, deeply influenced by their experiences, but how many people were not necessarily in combat, but were part of that war in Vietnam and affected by it.
And I think that's the thing, you know, I mean, people, when they think about war, they think about heroism and bravery and valor, and unfortunately, as we know, a lot of that has to do with death and dying and shooting and, like you said, combat. But if you realize that for the man in the field, or now a woman in the field too, who's doing that fighting, somebody has to give them their orders, somebody has to get them there, transport, somebody has to make their uniform, somebody has to write the story about what they're doing. So the old rule that we knew then was about, for every man in the field, there was about 6 of us in the rear. And so it's easy to do the math. So less than 500,000 of the 2.7 million Vietnam soldiers. Marines, it's a different story. Marines just fight. I mean, combat's their job. Right. But for the rest of us in the Army, and there were Navy folks there too, and some Air Force, that you know, we weren't doing that job, and there were more of us, a lot more of us. So what I was trying to get at in the book was not to say, you know, get puffed up and say our experience is better than your. It's just to say these are probably stories or people or incidents that you would not have heard about, because it's not about combat. It's about It's about boredom. It's about frustration. It's about romance. It's about just interactions with the Vietnamese in a totally different way.
It's about a lot of things, and I hope we get to some of them. DEROS.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it's interesting. Everybody knew their DERO state, and it stands for Date Eligible for Return from Overseas. Acronyms. The Army loves acronyms.
Oh, yeah.
But it was amazing because that was sacred. When you knew that, when you got there like I did, and you knew that 365 days from that day you were going home, and I could never in my total period there begin to count down from 3. Some guys did, and it was like, now I waited until I broke 100 to know that I was in double digits, and then, but I never, but that was sort of what, I mean, imagine you're out in the field and you know that, this is maybe your next to last patrol. Yep. But some people were very superstitious about it too, in terms of, who they were with on that day and where they went and et cetera, because you wanted to get back home.
Yeah. There's a few DEROS parties mentioned in the book, to be sure.
Yes.
I suspect that was a big part of life there. But also the idea that well, you talked about the superstition and the role that people played. A theme that shows up pretty consistently is this idea of not wanting to be the last GI killed in Vietnam. And it's interesting that would affect people's thinking.
Well, Neil, when we made the decision, and Nixon did, and that doesn't mean that there still weren't 30,000 guys that died after he became president. But the decision was made that we were going to turn over the ground war to the South Vietnamese Army, which did not go well. Not totally their fault, but they bear some responsibility for that. Escalate the air war, expand the war to Laos and Cambodia and Thailand in some ways. But that we were basically, it was pretty much saying, we're not going to fight to win this war. A lot of people thought that was our strategy all along, unfortunately. So it was like, well, don't put me in a situation where I could be the last GI killed in Vietnam. That's not a moniker that I want applied to me. Right. And so, this is when things got to be real hairy in terms of fraggings and AWOLs and, I'm not to say this was an army in mutiny, but there were places and parts of the army where it was close to a mutiny. Yep. Guys were refusing orders. Guys were telling their commanding officer, I'm not doing that, and don't mess with me.
Well, and in fact, a fragging is one of the dispatches from the air-conditioned jungle, and we're going to talk about some of them when we come back right after this.
One of about 5 people that was called out of the formation to go to this office, and they're sending me to the Army Hometown News Center in Kansas City, Missouri, because my MOS is 71Q20. I'm an information specialist. I'm an Army reporter. I'm a writer. Well, I was just, it was like I was shaking. I was so excited. I just thought, this is great. I'm not carrying a gun. And they go back to the formation where just about everybody in my unit was being assigned to advanced infantry training. And within a matter of 2 or 3 months, they were going to be in Vietnam. I couldn't share my joy for myself with them because I felt so terrible. Because these guys were just totally bummed out.
Who was that guy in the picture?
I was wondering too, with my little love beads there.
I think we would all say that it was Doug Bradley who was with me today. Doug Bradley is the author of the new book, DEROS Vietnam, Dispatches from the Air-Conditioned Jungle. And in that book, in that clip, of course, you're talking about fate, experience, the things that resulted in you having the job that you had in Vietnam, which is, of course, very much the point of this book. But what you did, Doug, a little bit to my surprise when I started reading it, was you took all of this experience and all of the thoughts that you've had about that, all of the emotion of the last 40 years, and turned it into a real interesting piece of writing. And I want you to talk a little bit about your thinking process about the way you told the stories, the way you blended fiction and nonfiction, and then sort of the interludes in the book,
Sure.
the stylistic interludes that just add context and I think richness to the book.
Well, thank you. That's what I was trying to accomplish. So to hear that from, what I would consider a smart reader like yourself, it really makes me feel good. I knew I wanted to write something because you can't not be a writer in that milieu and not say that you're going to do something about it. But on the other hand, that might be, an occupational hazard because you are so into words and trying to both express that experience, but also to analyze it, if you will. That I had to decompress, and it took me a while. I got a graduate. I went and got a master's degree in English. I came to Madison, was working on Vet's House. I was teaching at the UW Baraboo, and it had to settle. But I knew I wanted to do this, and of course, you got to write a novel, the great American novel. Anybody who's in English, ever been an English major or writer, is going to write the great American novel. And try as I could. And for me, there were a couple defining moments. One was becoming a parent. When I had a child, I started to think like, I had a daughter and a son, but given the way the Selective Service is working now, could I have the same feelings about losing that child to a war that I had some challenges with myself about this was what my son or daughter should do. And then it was when the wall in Vietnam, in Washington, D.C. was built. Those were sort of like those kind of moments where it's like, I got to get this done. I got to do it. So I started writing a novel that the scenes began at the wall and then sort of moved away from there. Try as I could, I couldn't, because with this journalist kind of background, I was used to doing shorter pieces. And then I turned one of the things I was writing, one of the chapters in the novel, into a story. And it worked. I mean, it's like it held together. There was a great plot, there were good characters, and it came together in 15 pages or so. And I thought, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. So I went back and looked at all the other stuff I'd written, and I was rereading Hemingway's In Our Time, the great book he wrote after World War I, having been an ambulance driver, having been wounded, the old Hemingway hero. And what I loved that Hemingway did in there was he put these little inner chapters in there that were very short pieces that were sort of an assessment on the war or the climate that was going on in Europe and around the war. And then in the middle, he'd have stories, some set in the war, but a lot of them not, except, you have a character like Nick Adams in The Big Two-Hearted River who's having PTSD. So I thought, this is the way to do this. I mean, I've got, 12, 15 stories in my head that I know are decent short stories. But I've got all these other little pieces that I want to pull out from those stories or put under a magnifying glass that I think can not only connect some of the themes and characters, but also resonate the experience of what Vietnam was like in the rear at this time.
I don't know if anything is as dramatic as the last chapter in the book, where you actually the narrator is Vietnamese, but the point I want to make here, Doug, is throughout it all, at some point in the book, the reader makes the choice to appreciate that the dramatizations are not just for dramatization's sake, but that there is truth in all of it. It may not be nonfiction, but that the actual accounts are essentially true.
Yeah, and that's
is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. In fact, it's one I would endorse and want to have somebody say. I just got a review the other day by a guy who was in the service a couple months before me. He was also in the rear in the Vietnam Veteran magazine, and I was so moved because he took one of the short pieces in there that's called Moron Corps. And that's not my term. That was the term that was applied to a program that McNamara and Johnson did to basically lower the standards for entrance into the Army, to promise these people in the barrio and the ghetto that this was going to be their ticket to, improving their lives, and stuck most of them in combat positions. So fatality rates were higher, desertion rates were higher, PTSD rates were higher, trauma, et cetera, wounded. So there was a fraud. So I just wrote this piece with that title, but I dramatized it. And for this guy to sort of talk about that as the story that most moved him and had the most truth for him, even though it was fictionalized. I don't know these people I made up and I put on the Chicago, sidewalk. But that's what a writer, I think, at least this writer was trying to get at. So I appreciate what you said, and I would hope other people who come to the book would have the same kind of reaction.
There are themes in the book that merit a book onto themselves, and I know one of them, music, is one that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But in terms of race and age and some of those really tough issues that were prevalent throughout society at the time, some of them prevalent still. The fact that they were so important to the experiences behind the scenes in Vietnam seems interesting to me.
Yeah, well, and as you indicated, this was happening stateside. I mean, this is the baby boom generation. We're beginning to challenge our parents to think twice about what the government tells us. We didn't know we were being lied to then for a while. We had suspicions.
Right.
And we were beginning to experiment with different things, in terms of drugs and politics and women and race. And boy, if that was happening here with 27 million of us, imagine it was like if you shrink that down to about, less than 3 million, and you put a war on top of that. I mean, if that is not a powder keg waiting to explode. So everything that was challenging us here, and was not just us as individuals, as our age group, but society in general, was doing that in spades in Vietnam. So it was very intense. That's not to say blacks and whites didn't get along. It's not to say everybody fragged their commanding officer. But it is to say that with that kind of stress and stressful situation, there was much more opportunity for things to really go crazy.
When we come back, we're going to talk about TV and rock and roll right after this.
I was seeing pretty discouraging stuff, but I couldn't report discouraging stuff. My job was to put on a happy face. I mean, things were fine. When I saw a story that I needed to write, I didn't write it. When I saw something that needed to be exposed, I didn't expose it. I mean, I was part of it. I was a GI in Vietnam. It was painful to go out and do stories and talk to guys, and when you had those moments when all of a sudden they would look at you and say, why do you have the pen and I've got the rifle? How did this happen to you and why didn't it happen to me? What do you say? There's no answer for that. I'm lucky, and I know it, and I'm sorry. That's about the best I could do.
I'm lucky, I know it, and I'm sorry. Doug Bradley writes about that in his new book, Daros Vietnam, Dispatches from the Air-Conditioned Jungle, which is available at all of the likely spots where you can get books. I'm sure it's available locally at a room of one's own, I would suspect. I want to suggest that first before people go to Amazon or someplace because it's available there too. So popular culture in the last 20 years and their treatment of Vietnam has, if not as a theme, certainly had the idea of music and the arts at the time as sort of a backdrop. But in fact, it was an important part of the experience there. I know that there's a book coming about music in Vietnam, and that really strikes me as fascinating. But also, you write in the book about television and watching television, and in a way, how that became part of that experience.
Well, and it was interesting because this was, everybody talks about it. Michael Arlen's got a great book about the living room war. This was the first TV war. It was covered. But everybody thinks of the Morley Safer or Walter Cronkite moment, Safer, when he saw them put the torch to the hut. And Cronkite, when he said, I thought we were winning this war, and basically he had gone there and said the war was over, which drove Johnson crazy. Basically, I think drove him out of the White House. But it was also, we grew up with television in ways that sort of nurtured us and connected us as a generation. So things like My Three Sons and Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet, we saw ourselves in those. So it was amazing sometimes because Armed Forces Television would be on a lot and run things, and it wasn't, blood and guts, although they showed combat. But Bonanza would be on. Room 222, which I have a story about in there.
Right, great story.
Yeah, so it's just kind of interesting that even though this was all around us, and it was a way, frankly, it was a way, I think, to change public opinion in some ways about the war and how it was being waged. For us, we weren't going to see any of that. What we took comfort in was maybe sharing a moment that would remind us of, hey, I knew a girl like that, or remember when we were growing up. It was a way for us to sort of be nostalgic.
This is terrible. We only have 2 minutes left. Let me just ask about, it's not explicit in this book, Doug, but I think it weaves a way through that there were people in your position, people in Vietnam who saw Vietnamese people a little differently than I think we saw them back home and then were portrayed here. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's very fair. In fact, it's one of the unfair things. I mean, this was their country. They call this the American War because they fought the French, they fought the Japanese, they fought the Chinese. They've been fighting their whole lives. And I think in some ways what I've talked about, it's not only a tragedy of the treatment we gave Vietnam veterans, it's a real tragedy about the treatment we gave the Vietnamese people, not just what we did there, but also what we've done post that war. And I sort of argue that because we didn't do the kind of healing we needed to for our warriors and for the vanquished, we really as a country still have sort of a hole in our hearts that we haven't filled. And that's part of the reason I think we've had kind of the problems we continue to have today.
A hole that's still there that maybe will never get filled, Doug?
That's my fear. I mean, we're far enough away from it. We paid lip service to the soldier, this time said you can disagree with the war but support the warrior. I don't know exactly what that means, and I don't know how that changes that. You go up to a veteran of this war right now and say that to him, they'll laugh at you or turn away. Because we have a debt and an obligation to them too, but 1% of them fought this war. In our era, it was a little more. It was a shared sacrifice. Yep. We don't do that with wars anymore.
So in 13, you and Craig Warner are going to be on this show to talk about a new book.
Absolutely, we're going to be dancing.
Music in Vietnam and the influence there. Great. This is a terrific book, Doug. Congratulations. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. I want to talk more.
I know, we just got warmed up. You were great. Thank you for reading that.
My thanks to Doug Bradley for being here. Next week, we'll talk about economic growth in the Madison area with the current president of Thrive, Paul Jaden. That's next Sunday. We'll see you then.